If you've ever owned land for a long time, real land, not a quarter-acre lot in a gated subdivision, but a piece of ground that becomes part of your life, then you probably understand what I'm about to tell you. Because this story isn't really about a fence. It isn't even about property lines. It's about what happens when someone mistakes patience for weakness and learns the difference the hard way. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and for nearly 23 years, I've lived outside a little town called Red Mesa, New Mexico. Nothing fancy. 60 acres, a weathered horse barn, a few cattle, 2 stubborn mules, and enough open sky to remind you every day that you're a very small part of a very big world. Most mornings started the same. Coffee before sunrise. Feed buckets rattling in the back of my truck. Coyotes disappearing into the brush as the sun crept over the horizon. It was the kind of life some people dream about and others would probably find boring. Personally, I loved every minute of it. At least I did until the Harlans moved in next door. Now, when they first arrived, I honestly tried to give them a chance. Around here, that's what people do. Doesn't matter where you're from. You wave. You introduce yourself. Maybe you bring over a pie or offer help if somebody's trailer gets stuck after a storm. It's just neighborly. But from the beginning, something felt off about the Harlans. They weren't bad people exactly. At least not in the obvious way. They were wealthy. Very wealthy. The kind of wealthy where every vehicle looked like it belonged in a luxury car commercial and every conversation somehow circled back to investment portfolios or vacation properties. They tore down the old adobe ranch house that had sat on that property for decades and replaced it with a giant modern home made almost entirely of glass and black steel. The thing looked less like a ranch house and more like a corporate headquarters that had gotten lost on its way to Phoenix. I remember standing beside my fence one evening watching construction finish up and thinking, well, that's certainly something. What I didn't realize was that the house wasn't the biggest change they were bringing. It was their attitude. The first incident happened maybe 6 weeks after they moved in. I was checking water troughs when I noticed 2 golden doodles racing through my pasture, scattering a group of calves. One calf ended up tangled in a section of wire fencing and cut its leg badly enough that I had to call the vet. I walked over later that afternoon and spoke with the owner, a man named Preston Harland. Nice smile. Expensive watch. Perfect teeth. He apologized immediately. Said it wouldn't happen again. Fair enough, I thought. People make mistakes. Except a few weeks later, it happened again. Then again. Then came the dirt bikes. His twin grandsons, maybe 16 or 17 years old, started treating the neighboring properties like their personal motocross course. One Saturday, I caught them cutting across my grazing field, kicking up dust, and leaving tire tracks through an area I'd spent months restoring after a dry season. I drove over on my ATV and asked them politely to stay off my property. One kid looked at the other and laughed. Then he said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. He looked straight at me and said, "Man, it's just empty land." What's the big deal, empty land? Funny thing about that phrase. People who work land never call it empty. Every acre means something. Every fence line, every water source, every patch of grass. You spend enough years caring for a place, and it becomes part of who you are. But these kids had clearly learned a different lesson from somewhere. I tried talking to Preston again. Then his wife, Veronica. Same result every time. Smile. Nod. Apology. Nothing changed. And little by little, I started noticing a pattern. They weren't ignoring me because they forgot. They were ignoring me because they genuinely believed there would never be consequences. Then one morning, everything changed. I was walking the southern edge of my property after a windstorm, checking for damage, when I spotted something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Brand new fence posts. Fresh cedar. Perfectly aligned. Stretching across the far side of my pasture. At first, I figured maybe a contractor had stacked materials in the wrong spot. But the closer I got, the worse the feeling became. Because this wasn't temporary. Somebody had built an entire fence overnight. And as I stood there staring at those polished cedar panels gleaming in the morning sunlight, a knot started forming in my stomach. Because even from a distance, I knew exactly where that fence should have been, and exactly where it wasn't. I stood there for a long moment, just looking at it, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me. Sometimes distance can fool you out in the open country. A fence line can seem crooked when it isn't. A hill can distort perspective. So I drove back to the house, dug through a filing cabinet in my office, and pulled out every survey document I had. Some of those papers were older than my truck. I spread them across the kitchen table, checked coordinates, compared measurements, then loaded everything into my ATV and headed back out. The more I measured, the less I liked what I was finding. By noon, there was no doubt left. The Harlan's new fence wasn't on the property line. It wasn't even close. At its deepest point, it crossed nearly 10 feet into my land and stretched for well over 600 feet. What made it worse was the fact that they had already started landscaping inside the area. Decorative stone, young trees, solar pathway lights. It looked like they'd already decided that section belonged to them. That evening, I drove over to their house. The timing couldn't have been more ridiculous. Jazz music drifted from hidden outdoor speakers. A fire feature glowed beside their pool. Several guests stood around sipping wine while watching the sunset over my pasture like it was part of the entertainment package. Preston answered the door holding a drink. I handed him a copy of the survey. "There's a problem," I said. "Your fence is on my property." Before he could respond, Veronica stepped up beside him. She glanced at the papers for maybe 2 seconds before giving me a smile that somehow managed to be polite and insulting at the same time. "According to our contractor," she said, "the fence is exactly where it belongs." I pointed toward the survey. "The markers say otherwise." Then she said the sentence that changed everything. "Well, honestly, Ethan, you weren't doing anything with that strip anyway." I don't know if it was the words themselves or the way she said them. Maybe both. But in that moment, something clicked in my head. Because she wasn't talking about a surveying mistake. She was talking about value. In her mind, if she couldn't see a purpose for something, then maybe somebody else didn't deserve to own it. I left without arguing. Didn't raise my voice. Didn't threaten anybody. But for the first time since they'd moved in, I stopped worrying about being a good neighbor. 3 days later, I contacted the county land office. The inspector they sent was an older surveyor named Hank Mercer. He looked like he'd spent 50 years fighting fences and had won every single battle. We spent most of the morning walking property markers and checking coordinates. Around lunchtime, he finally lowered his equipment, looked toward the Harlan's fence, and shook his head. "That's not even a close call," he said. "They're way over." The county issued a formal notice less than a week later. Remove the encroachment within 30 days or face penalties. Pretty simple. Most reasonable people would have fixed the problem immediately. Maybe blamed the contractor. Maybe complained about the expense. But they would have fixed it, not the Harlans. If anything, they became even more stubborn. A few days after the notice arrived, I watched landscapers install additional shrubs along the disputed section. Veronica stood nearby, holding an iced coffee, supervising the work like she was planning a magazine photo shoot. When she noticed me watching, she smiled and waved. That was the moment I stopped thinking about the fence. Instead, I started thinking about the future. See, one thing people misunderstand about ranchers is that we're often patient because we're used to thinking long-term. Droughts teach patience. Livestock teaches patience. Land teaches patience. We don't usually react fast. But when we finally decide to act, we've already spent a long time considering every angle. That evening, I called an old friend named Wade Morrison. Wade owned a construction company about 40 miles north of Red Mesa. We'd known each other since high school football. "I need a building," I told him. "How big?" he asked. I looked out my kitchen window toward the southern pasture. "Big enough to make a point." There was silence on the line. Then Wade laughed. "Now you've got my attention." Over the next several days, I met with county officials, zoning personnel, and an attorney. Every permit, every setback requirement, every regulation. I checked everything twice. Then I checked it again. If I was going to do this, it had to be completely legal. No shortcuts, no gray areas, no mistakes. My attorney actually approved of the plan. He explained that maintaining active, visible use of the area strengthened my position and demonstrated continuous control of the property. From a legal standpoint, it made perfect sense. From a personal standpoint, well, let's just say it had some additional benefits. Construction started on a Monday morning at 6:30 sharp. If you've never heard a steel frame agricultural building being assembled at sunrise, imagine every loud noise known to mankind happening simultaneously. Diesel engines growling, generators humming, metal beams clanging together, impact drivers screaming through the morning air. By 8 o'clock, I saw Preston marching across the pasture toward the work site. Even from a distance, he looked furious. "What is this?" he shouted. I climbed down from my tractor and took a sip of coffee. "New livestock barn." His face turned red. "You can't put that there." I pointed toward the survey markers. "Actually, I can." Veronica arrived a minute later with her phone already recording. "You're doing this on purpose," she snapped. "You're trying to ruin our property value." "Maybe," I said. "Still legal." For a second, she just stared at me. I think she expected an argument. Expected me to yell. Instead, I gave her paperwork. Permits. Approvals. Surveys. Every document neatly organized. The expression on her face when she realized everything was official was honestly worth the cost of printing. Construction continued for 2 straight weeks. The structure grew fast. 30-foot steel frame. Cedar siding. Heavy-duty roofing. By the end of the second week, it stretched almost the entire length of the disputed boundary. And I made one design choice that some people still debate whenever they hear this story. The attractive side faced my ranch. The solid rear wall faced the Harlans. From their infinity pool, their outdoor lounge area, and their expensive patio, the mountain view they loved so much had been replaced by the backside of a working livestock barn. Not illegal, not even remotely, just inconvenient. Very, very inconvenient. But the real turning point hadn't happened yet, because the moment that truly broke the Harlans was still coming, and it arrived 3 days after the last construction crew packed up and left. The first morning after the barn was finished, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see it in silence before the day got loud again. There's a different kind of stillness out here before sunrise, like the whole land is holding its breath. I poured a cup of coffee, stepped onto the porch, and just watched the new structure sitting along the southern pasture. It wasn't even fully used yet, but already it felt permanent, like it had always belonged there. And I knew exactly what it was going to do to the Harlans, even before they realized it themselves. That afternoon, I moved the cattle closer. Not all of them, just enough to make the point. A dozen head grazing near the barn, shifting dust into the wind, doing what cattle do without any awareness that they were about to become part of a very expensive argument. Livestock smells are funny that way. You don't notice them if you live in them. But if you don't, they follow you. They settle in places you didn't expect. And within a few days, I started noticing the Harlans spending less time outside. The first real confrontation after that came from Preston calling the sheriff. I didn't hear the call, of course, but I saw the deputy's truck roll up one afternoon while I was fixing a water line. The deputy walked the property, looked at the barn, checked the paperwork, and then had a long conversation with Preston near the fence line. When he came back to his truck, he glanced at me and said, almost casually, "You're good. Everything checks out." That should have been the end of it. But people like the Harlans don't tend to stop at "you're good." About a week later, they brought in a lawyer from Dallas. Expensive suit, polished boots, the kind of man who looked like he charged by the sentence. He introduced himself like we were already in a courtroom. "My clients are experiencing what we would describe as intentional nuisance construction," he said, gesturing toward the barn. I leaned against the fence post and let him finish. He went on about property enjoyment, devaluation, hostile intent. Big words, clean delivery, confident tone. When he finally paused, I handed him a folder. Inside was everything: county approval, zoning permits, inspection reports, certified survey maps, photos of the original encroachment, and a letter from my attorney outlining potential adverse possession risk on their side if they failed to comply with the county order. I didn't say a word, just watched him read. The confidence drained out of him in real time, like someone had slowly turned down a light inside his head. "This is very thorough," he finally said. "It has to be," I replied. That was the end of the legal intimidation angle. But the physical reality didn't change. The barn stayed. The cattle stayed. And the wind kept carrying that honest ranch smell straight toward their glass patio an infinity pool like nature itself, had decided to get involved in the dispute. 2 weeks later, county enforcement escalated the fines, daily penalties, increasing amounts, each notice arriving in a clean white envelope that looked almost polite for something that was financially devastating. I watched contractors arrive early one morning on the Harlan side. Not mine. Theirs. They began dismantling the fence section by section under county supervision. No drama. No speeches. Just work. Cedar panels coming down. Steel posts pulled from the ground. Decorative landscaping removed and hauled away in trucks that didn't stay long enough for anyone to pretend it wasn't happening. I was standing by my barn when Preston walked over. He didn't have the same energy anymore. No arrogance. No frustration. Just something heavier. "You really went through all this over 10 feet of land?" he asked. I looked at the fence line as another section came down. "No," I said. "I went through all this because you thought I wouldn't do anything about it." He didn't respond. Not immediately. Then he looked around, like he was seeing the property for the first time instead of the version he had imagined when he moved in. "We didn't think it mattered," he said quietly. I nodded. That was the problem. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. The grand party stopped. The ATVs disappeared. The guests stopped coming. The glass house still stood there, but it felt quieter, emptier, like the energy had drained out of it. Eventually, word got around that the Harlans were planning to sell. I didn't feel victory in the way people assume you would. It wasn't fireworks or celebration. It was just quiet resolution, like a storm passing without destroying everything in its path, but still leaving the air different afterward. One evening near sunset, I saw Preston one last time from a distance. He was standing near the now-removed fence line, just looking out over the pasture. No words this time. No confrontation. Just a man realizing too late that land doesn't care about assumptions or wealth or confidence. It only cares about boundaries. After he left, I stayed outside for a while longer than usual. Watched the cattle move slowly through the pasture. Watched the sun drop behind the hills. And I thought about how strange it is that most conflicts like this never start big. They start small. A dog crossing a line. A tire track. A sentence that sounds harmless in the moment. But left unchecked, they grow into something much larger than anyone expected. People like to think these stories are about revenge, or justice, or who wins. But that's not really it. It's about what happens when respect disappears from the equation. When one side decides rules are optional, and the other side decides silence is no longer an option. So here's the question I keep thinking about, even now. If you were in my place, would you have waited for the county, followed every rule, and let the system handle it like I did? Or would you have handled it differently from the start? I'll leave that to you, because I've learned something out here on this land. Every boundary tells a story, and sooner or later, everyone finds out which side of it they're really standing on. If you've ever dealt with neighbors who push too far, or seen a situation like this unfold in your own life, I want to hear about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real stories like this, make sure to stick around, because out here in places like this, stories like this don't happen as rarely as people think.